Well, good morning, church. We've been in a series we began last week called Friends of God. And we talked about Abraham. And many of you, if you hear about Abraham, you kind of begin to think, well, he's Abraham. That's different. Abraham's a different breed. And we think that about Elijah too. But the word reminds us that these stories are for our instruction. And James tells us that Elijah was a man like every other human being. He was a man like we are. And so when we talk about Abraham, he's a human being. And at the same time, we look at the life of his family, we look at the life and the legacy of these amazing men and women of God throughout Scripture, and there's something that seems just super heroic in the way they lived their lives. And there was, but I believe that the key factor is friendship with God. But not all of us have the purity maybe that Abraham had. Maybe we began a little bit more rough around the edges when we began our journey with the Lord. I was thinking about just a few days ago. It wasn't very long ago that I woke up, or I just had this, I woke up finally kind of realizing I've just had enough. I'm done with being extremely just worn out and discouraged. It was weighing on me. It was like this pressure. It was just this heaviness. It was a sorrow. I couldn't even point to one thing about what was going on in my soul. And so I lift up to the Lord, just this whole burden of just this feeling of feeling, again, overwhelmed, isolated, heavy-hearted. And I prayed. I just said, God, what is going on here? I need to be released from this heaviness, this oppression. And I heard the Lord say, whispering to my heart, I will lift you up and pull you to my face. And I'll never forget it. And so I just said, okay, well, that sounds like we're setting an appointment. So I found the first empty room I could find, and I shut the door, and I just said, okay, Lord, let's go ahead. What's in my soul? What's happening in my soul? Because sometimes we don't even understand what is happening in our own hearts and minds. And it just takes time, which is why David says, why are you downcast, O my soul? He begins to speak to his soul, asking, let's follow the breadcrumbs of what we dropped, where the piece fell along the way, and go back and find it. And so as I got before the Lord, I began to write down a list of things I felt like he was revealing to me. A few culprits of thieves of my peace. And I kind of envisioned lining them up like a lineup in a police station. And I was pointing them out. Yep, all three of them. They've all been thieves. And I got before the Lord, and I just poured out my heart and just began to ask him to help me recover what those three foes of my life had stolen. But it happened to be a season where the people in my life who are normally so very present, it just was the kind of season where everybody was just in the busyness of life, and it felt like I was just kind of in this by myself. Ever been there before? Where you're just facing the stuff of life, and it just seems like right now there's no one to carry it with you. There's no one to absorb the blows with you, and you're just kind of carrying it by yourself. Those are really hard times. Those are times where we begin to ask, what are you doing? Where are you? And so it was one of those moments. I was looking around. It felt like I had a very small, my circle was nowhere to be seen. Again, just life happens. People were busy. And yet I just felt this extreme heaviness. And it became just one of the heaviest moments I've gone through in a long, long time. Abraham, this man of God, this man of great faith who believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness, had a son, Isaac. Isaac was the son of promise. Isaac has another son named Jacob. And Jacob begins his journey a little rough around the edges. His very name means deceiver. It means to betray, to seize someone by the heel, to deceive, and to cheat. And it began with him stealing his brother's birth. Well, actually, if you go back, it goes back to him grabbing the heel of Esau as they're being born. But then he steals he deceives Esau into his birthright, stealing his birthright, taking his birthright, apprehending it, but for a bowl of soup. So Esau is hungry, and he gives him this bowl of lentil soup, and he has no birthright, but now Jacob has his brother's birthright. And, Esau saw right through, I did not mean to plan that, to sound that way, but it works. But he saw right through who Jacob was. He says this, he's lamenting to his father as his father's trying to bless them. He says this in Genesis 27, verse 36. Esau said, "Is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has cheated me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he's taken away my blessing." And then he said, "Have you not reserved a blessing for me too?" The blessing was not just a few nice flowery words. The blessing had authority. The blessing of a patriarch, the blessing of a father, an authority figure, carried a lot of weight. And so it wasn't like he could just say the same thing, copy and paste, you too. And so Esau recognized what had been taken from him. And so he, of course, this caused separation. Jacob runs, he flees, he works for Laban. Laban cheats him, so Jacob gets to receive a little bit of his own medicine. He's cheated, but he's also trying to cheat Laban. Something about Jacob and flocks. He likes to mess with Laban's flocks. He gets to prosper and benefit from Laban's flocks in a way that he's prospering more than the owner of his own flocks. And then there's this very interesting story where he breeds them a certain way in front of certain spotted, speckled sticks. And I don't understand it except for the fact that God is allowing Jacob in his deceptive ways, but also the authority that he has to take him down a journey of this great promise that God had promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so when he has to flee, he brings his family with him because, of course, he leaves Jacob he leaves Laban because what he finds out is that Laban is not happy with the way that Jacob has been treating him. Jacob would say the same thing about Laban, I'm sure. But he leaves in the middle of the night, and Laban pursues him, and they have this conversation. They just have this peaceful pact. I'll leave you alone, you leave me alone. They part ways, but Jacob has to return home. On his journey back home, he has to pass through the place again, through Seir, which is where Esau lives. And so when he goes there, it says that he begins to realize, or he hears that Esau is aware of Jacob because Jacob sends this big procession of gifts, a lot more flocks, cattle, oxen, sheep. Esau sends 400 men. So Jacob is thinking the worst, that he's getting revenge. And all of a sudden, like all of his deceitful, deceptive ways are coming back to haunt him. And he's struck with this great fear. And he's confronted with who he's been all along has not been good. And that there might actually be consequences for his actions. And so Jacob begins to enter this really dark night of the soul. He divides his whole entourage so that if Esau attacks, half of his people will survive. And so he sends his family, his servants, his possessions across the brook. And when he does that, it says this in Genesis chapter 32, verses 22 through 24. That same night he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had, and Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. And so Jacob was left alone. These kind of moments, these midnight appointments, are defining moments. And what was happening is that sometimes these significant encounters with God are for significant moments. These significant midnight moments are for a reason. Jesus had his moments, of course, in the wilderness for 40 days by himself. Of course, he was in Gethsemane. Eli was woken up by the voice of God when he was a young child in the middle of the night. It was a defining moment for his life. And there are all these many moments all throughout Scripture. Abraham's was when we talked about this last week, where he's brought outside to look at the stars and to receive the promise of his inheritance. And so, but each one of them were going these journeys alone. Each one of them had to face this time with God alone. So I have a question for you. We're talking about friendship of God with God. Has God ever been your only friend? I want to look through this moment of this really interesting story. I don't think it's offensive to God for us to call this story weird. I think there are a lot of stories that we would say, Lord, that was weird. That was just weird. But the stories that are weird are really, really worth really digging into, really investing into deeper, because in the weird things, the things that make us say, what is going on? God is doing something. And so in the moments of our lives where you might look around and be like, this was a weird moment in my life, maybe it was God drawing attention to something out of the box that he's doing in your life. So, this one point, here's my question again. Has God ever been your only friend? We look at Jacob's life and we see some elements of friendship beginning in the life of Jacob. Again, Jacob was not perfect. We look at Abraham, we want friendship with God like Abraham. Jacob was a patriarch. And yet we look at his story and he's just a mess. But everybody starts in their journey with God and their friendship with God somewhere. And so I like his starting point. Friendship becomes real through hard times. That's what Jacob is learning through this very interesting encounter with this wrestling match in the middle of the night. He's left alone. He crosses the Jabbok. He's left alone, probably just to pray, probably just to be quiet, probably just to think about what's going to happen next. And then he's attacked by a man. He's probably thinking this is either Esau or Esau's someone from his army, but he has no idea what's going on right away. I don't blame him. All he knows is he's going to fight back, but he's fighting in this middle of the night relationship or this wrestling match. Wrestling is up close and personal. It's also very exhausting. Can you imagine wrestling for all night long? This stranger who just comes and overpowers you, and that would be exhausting until daybreak, it says. But what's happening? What's interesting is that at this moment, there's nobody for Jacob to rely on. He has everybody that he would really depend on. He's sent across the brook. He's wrestling with fears of what's happening possibly right around the corner to his family. What's going to happen with Esau? He's sending 400 men. Are they going to overpower us? Is he going to kill me? Am I finally getting back what I deserve? And then he has this wrestling match. This man appears in the middle of the night and begins to wrestle with him until daybreak, exhausting him. That is just, I've had those times where, like I just mentioned, there was nobody else to call on. And those very defining moments, those really difficult moments, God can become your only friend. I've had many midnight moments of wrestling. One of them was when my son John was in the hospital with pneumonia in his right lung. It was completely infected. It was a horrible infection of pneumonia. And he stayed in the hospital for 5 days. So Sarah and John were in the hospital for 5 days. I had my other 3 kids at my mom and dad's house because my kids didn't want to sleep at home with our family separated. So we all slept at my parents' house. And right after I got the kids down for bed, Sarah called me and she said, well, they're kind of concerned because he has arrhythmia. And so what happened is what happens to many of us when we're apprehended with fear. When you begin to just imagine the worst case scenario, you just begin to imagine a future where God has been removed from the picture and your very worst fears are realized. And so I was fearing everything. I was entertaining every possible terror that could be imagined in that moment. And I cried out to God, and God met me there. And I'm so thankful for those midnight moments because when there's nobody else to call on, nobody else to cling to, then we inadvertently will look up and just realize, oh, you're still here. I'm going to acknowledge that I still have a God who loves me, who knows the end from the beginning, a God who is completely in control, that I can call on in the midnight hours, and he comes and he meets us where we are. And then a few days pass after John was discharged from the hospital. He got his heart monitor for about 2 weeks. The arrhythmia was gone. It was all just done by infection from the pneumonia. Caused his heart to be out of rhythm. But in the moment, in the midnight wrestling, you're thinking the absolute worst. And so that's kind of where Jacob was. He's up close and personal with this stranger who attacks him in the middle of the night. And he's having this conversation. Now that would be interesting. He's having a conversation. At this moment, there's nobody for Jacob to deceive. There's nobody for him to manipulate. He is completely stripped of power, except his own physical human strength. He's only able to rely literally on his own physical human strength. When it gets to that point, we're in trouble. And that's sometimes exactly where God wants us to be. In trouble enough to where he becomes our only source of rescue. And so we keep reading in Genesis chapter 32, verses 25 through 28. It says this, when the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was out of joint as he wrestled with him. And then he said, let me go, for the day is broken. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. And the man said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have not prevailed. And have prevailed. Thank you. This reminds me of yesterday at a wedding when I married the bride to the bride. Let's just get rid of all polish at CCF. And let's just be people who do life together. Now I lost my train of thought. He prevailed. He prevailed. And I had a reason for thinking he did not prevail, because in a way he did, and I'll get there in a moment. This man, you probably know who he is. The man is God, because he wrestles with God. We'll see that in a moment. This is what many scholars call a Christophany, a pre-incarnate appearing of Jesus before his birth with Mary. It's an appearance of God in the flesh, and he's wrestling with Jacob. And then this interesting conversation. He said, let me go, for the day is broken. Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. What is your name? Jacob, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. But what's happening here is that what he's realizing is that to be face to face with God, we must face the truth about ourselves. This conversation takes an interesting turn, which, by the way, having a conversation during the middle of a wrestling match is pretty interesting to begin with. But he says, let me go, day is broken. No, I'm not going to let you go until you bless me. And then he says, what is your name? And it's as if the Lord wants Jacob to say his name out loud. Deceiver. Bless me. What's your name? Just deceiver. It's manipulator. That's kind of humbling, isn't it? If God asks you your name, find out what it means. When God named me Daniel, God is my judge. I've had to contend my entire life with letting him and him alone be my judge. So sometimes God uses your name to reveal to you how he's working in your life. And so he says this, what is your name? Jacob. But here's what's interesting. When he saw that he did not prevail. It's not that it says he could not prevail, it's that he did not prevail. Jacob did not give up. Jacob continued to wrestle. Now the angel, the man, the messenger, God in the flesh in this moment could have, it says he touched the hip socket of Jacob and he came out of joint. God can win any wrestling match. What was the prevailing that Jacob did was he just kept going and that he clung to God. All he could do was hold on. So if you're in a wrestling match with the Lord, just hold on. That's all you need to do is hold on. That's how we prevail. Jacob by no means overpowered the Lord. He just held on. It reminds me of when we went horseback riding. I was dating Sarah. I wasn't even planning on telling this story. Well, we weren't dating. I was trying to impress her. She said, do you ride horses? I said, oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. We have a horse. We have one. And so I saddled my horse, and I met Sarah and her sister Joy. I saddled my horse after watching my dad do it a few times, and I figured I can do this. So I got about 2 miles to the edge of my road, and then we began to ride, and things were going really well. I mean, I did know how to steer. I knew how to say, let's go. I knew how to slap the reins on his shoulders, but I did not know how to deal with pot-bellied pigs. Because we rode right by Roy Devishire's house. Roy's not here. Maybe he's watching online. Roy, your pot-bellied pig almost killed me. We're riding by his house. Pot-bellied pig runs up to the fence squealing, and my horse freaks out, and he begins to buck. I wasn't properly prepared for the bucking. So what happened was my saddle turned sideways. And as my horse is bucking, I'm trying to keep my head from slamming into Roy Devishire's fence posts. And I got off the horse involuntarily. I reapplied the saddle, and I hung my head and rode home in shame. But she was still impressed. So I wrestled, and I prevailed. There. I had to tie that in. But as Jacob cries out, he says, you need to bless me. I love what Hosea gives a different perspective of what's happening here. Hosea chapter 12, verses 3 through 4. In the womb, he took his brother by the heel. In his manhood, he strove with God. He strove with the angel and prevailed, and wept and sought his favor. So he wept and he travailed in prayer for a blessing. And the blessing comes in the form of, what is your name? I'm deceiver. I'm the manipulator. When God asks your name, or when he asks any question, it's not because he doesn't know the answer. But then he tells him, your name is no longer Jacob. Your name is Israel. Israel means, it's a compound word in Hebrew that means to struggle, and it also means God. El at the end means God. Now, in Hebrew etymology and names, when it's talking specifically about the Lord, it's not only, it would be too simple just to say it means God fights, or God, or like wrestled with God or fought with God. God becomes the centerpiece of the name that's describing him. So in other words, most scholars will say that it means God struggles or God fights, but another translation, another interpretation is that it means God rules. And so what he's telling Jacob to look at this moment is that Jacob is no longer relevant. You're manipulating, you're manipulative and your controlling ways are no longer forefront. From now on, God rules. From now on, it's about me. From now on, it's about my plans, my heart, my plans, my dreams, my desires coming to fruition. And yours become irrelevant in a way because he absorbs our desires with his own, and his plan with his own. And so this question, it says this in verse 29. Why is it that you ask my name? Or Jacob says, tell me your name. He says, why do you ask my name? Because at this point, Jacob already knows. He knows who he's wrestling with. And it says, there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip, and therefore to this day the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hips on the sinew of the thigh. And he asked this question, why are you asking me my name? Because he proposes that Jacob already knows. And then it says that this verse in verse 29, there he blessed him. Jacob asks for a blessing and gets a new name, and yet still we see that God comes along the back end and he says he still blessed him. But this time the blessing that he received wasn't manipulated, it wasn't stolen, it wasn't a lie, it was a request that God granted the right way. Because God rules, because God reigns. And if God's going to bless you, it's going to be on his terms. And sometimes it's going to mean that we have to face the truth about our past and who we were. And then this, it's not about striving for victory, it's about embracing surrender. That is what caused the prevailing in Jacob. That's what caused him to prevail. His life was delivered. He saw God face to face. He names the place Peniel, which means face to face with God. And so he didn't defeat God as much as he defeated himself by holding on to God. And the baggage and the reputation that he had earned through deception and manipulation was being stripped away to where God became the center point and he became the forefront. And so I want to read this because he walks away from there and he says this out loud. He says, I've seen God face to face and yet my life has been delivered. He didn't die like he was expecting he would die. Many scholars believe that the reason that the man says to release me before daybreak is because he doesn't want Jacob to see his face. But yet there he is face to face in this encounter. And yet this wrestling match with Jacob just holding on for all of his might, ends with Jacob's life being delivered. Because the trajectory of his life from that point forward was different. Before, he sent his family ahead of him to go to Esau, or to get away from Esau. But this time, he returned from this encounter to go meet Esau, and he goes before his family. And everything begins to shift from this point forward, because in chapter 35, he builds an altar to the Lord, and he's at that point, the Lord meets him and reestablishes, your name is Israel. And he reestablishes a covenant that he had got, that was given to Abraham and Isaac. And so Jacob is also now, he's brought into, through blessing, through surrender, he's brought into this covenant that had been made with his forefathers. And then later on, at the end of his life in Egypt, he blesses the sons of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, by crossing his right hand over his left. Joseph doesn't like this because he's doing it wrong. Jacob's not doing it wrong. He's following friendship with God. Friendship with God is listening to his voice. He's breaking precedence because he's listening to the voice of God speaking to him about the future of Ephraim and Manasseh. And Ephraim does become greater. When he uses his right hand, the right hand represents authority and power. So by laying his hand on Ephraim, he's endowing power and saying, this one's greater. Because he's in relationship with the God who's speaking these things, who already knows how everything's going to turn out. God's revealing his secrets to Jacob through friendship. And it begins with a wrestling match. But I love how just before this moment, here he lets us in on what his life has been like and what his relationship, his secret life with God has been turning into over the years. In Genesis chapter 48, verses 15 through 16, he blessed Joseph and said, the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked. And then I love this part, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day. The angel who has redeemed me from evil. Bless the boys, and in them let my name be carried on, in the name of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. God has been my shepherd all my life. He's been my deliverance. And then, even in that prophecy, he lays hands on Judah, and he prophesies straight from the heart of God, his friend, that from the scepter, or from Judah shall ascend the scepter, and that reign will never end. And he's prophesying of the Messiah. Let's stand together. So I was in that moment where I was lining up those three enemies that God had helped me to identify, those those foes, I guess you'd call them. I had them lined up against the wall in my mind. I identified what they were. And as I began to pray against those things and to repent for even letting the influence of those lies into my life, the presence of God came in the room in a way that I've never experienced. And I felt the presence and the nearness of God in a way that I haven't felt in a very, very long time. And I remembered that he said, I will lift you up to my face, because I felt like I was face to face with God. But I had to wrestle. I had to face and confront. But here's what happens when we're wrestling and God becomes our only friend. I was reading about a study of shared suffering. A psychologist studied veterans and athletes and people who endure trauma together. And he began to notice that there was this correlation, there was this intimacy between the people who suffered together. So, to do a few experiments, he had this group of study subjects stand up against the wall or lean against the wall and do those sitting squats where you just have to sit there and endure the burn forever. They're the worst, but they did those together. Then they had to plunge their hand into an ice cold bucket for a full minute together. And they had these other tests that these psychologists subjected them to of little experiences of suffering. And what happened was that afterwards, after these little tests of suffering together, they began to notice that these people had a camaraderie. There was an understanding between them. They were relating about the freezing ice. They were relating about the pain in their hamstrings. They were just relating about all the things, even the hot peppers they had to eat, how much milk they drank, and just how they endured it together. And so when we are talking about these moments where we have to endure and to wrestle, I want to mention a couple other things that the psychologist summarized this way, that closeness, this shared suffering, removes pretense, it creates empathy, and it creates a shared story. When God is your only friend, you are not alone. What you're cultivating with Him is a shared story, because He is with us in our suffering. And we begin to identify with Him in His suffering. And it's this camaraderie with the God of heaven that we share suffering with Him. And it's cultivating a story. I'm going to open up the altar for a moment, and I'd like to ask our altar team to come forward. And some of you are just needing someone to take you by the hand because maybe you've been wrestling all through the night all by yourself. And this could be the moment that the Lord is just saying, take someone by the hand because daybreak is here. You don't need to be alone anymore. And maybe you just need someone to come alongside you to take you by the hand and help you make sense of the limp that you're carrying, because it's meaningful. And there's history being written right now. If you will endure, if you don't give up, if you don't let go, your only role right now is to hold on with all of your might. Okay? So church, let's take a moment. Let's come to the altar and let's bring this to Him.